This is the Capitol Rundown.
I don't think the effort is so much to ultimately convict Trump as is to make a challenge for him to ever be reelected again.
We've seen some of the agencies that have gone out of business, others just simply have suffered.
But here he is in a statistical dead heat with Elissa Slotkin.
It's all straight ahead. The Capitol Rundown starts now.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Siobhan Klepfer. It was a historic week in American politics as a former president faced federal criminal charges. We're talking about Donald Trump and his handling of classified material. Mr. Trump was in a courtroom on Tuesday to hear the 37 charges against him. Washington correspondent Jesse Tenor has more on those charges and the reaction to them.
I had every right to have these documents.
Donald Trump continues to defend himself as he becomes the first former president to face federal criminal charges.
Threatening me with 400 years in prison for possessing my own presidential papers, which just about every other president has done.
In Florida, Tuesday afternoon, Trump pleaded not guilty to 37 charges related to his alleged mishandling of classified documents. And with supporters at his New Jersey golf club Tuesday night, Trump referred to the charges as election interference and political persecution.
A corrupt sitting president had his top political opponent arrested on fake and fabricated charges.
The majority of Republicans in Congress continue to defend Trump as he remains the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2024.
When the president's main opponent for his reelection seems to be treated in a very different way than anyone else, including Joe Biden himself or Hillary Clinton or others. That's what people can't get beyond.
While Louisiana Congressman Steve Scalise vows to hold the FBI and Justice Department accountable, the Senate's top Democrat, Leader Chuck Schumer, says lawmakers should stay out of it.
We don't need political interference. We need strong law enforcement, and Donald Trump's not above the law, plain and simple.
In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
One of the Republicans in Congress defending former President Trump is 5th Congressional Representative Tim Walberg. The Rundown caught up with the congressman to get his take on the charges.
Well, it was not unexpected. It's been 8 years of the liberal element in our society trying to get President Trump. So far, they've not been able to do that. And I don't think the effort is so much to ultimately convict Trump as is to make a challenge for him to ever be reelected again. And even beyond that, to put down his movement of supporters that have been brought into the fray of politics in the past number of years. And this is a president who has the ability to declare what's classified and what isn't classified. This is a president who had documents in his hands as a president and subsequently following his presidency. But we're leaving aside people like President Joe Biden, who had classified documents in his hands, in his collection, in an insecure setting since he was a senator and as a vice president, who had no ability to declare something unclassified. That's a major concern. That would lead me to believe that this Department of Justice is not fair and balanced, at the very least, is not following their responsibility under the law and under the Constitution. So I will consider everything that Merrick Garland, the head of the FBI, Mr. Wray, everything suspect relative to ultimate findings from the other side as well. The former president should be within the law and the Constitution. And as I read the Constitution and talking with and listening to the discourses on the Constitution relative to the president's capability to control classified documents, to declassify, and what he's done in relationship to presidents down through history and court cases, President Trump is within the law. This is an unfair display of unequal justice. And as far as I'm concerned, until something is shown that indeed President Trump didn't have the law on his side in the Constitution, I will remain supportive of saying that Justice Department is not living up to its name.
You heard Congressman Wahlberg say that Donald Trump had the ability to declassify documents, which is true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Some information is so classified it's supposed to be kept in a special security facility, and Mar-a-Lago is not one of them. And according to the National Archives, the Presidential Records Act requires that all records created by presidents be turned over to the National Archives at the end of their administrations, which is why some legal experts say Trump might have a tough time making his case.
The reason why this argument is so hard to make that these are personal records and not presidential records or agency records is because they're classified documents on their face. They're literally created by another agency with classified information.
While a lot was happening on the legal front this week, lawmakers in Lansing were busy working on a bunch of bills. Up next, we'll tell you about the legislation that might soon become law. That's when the Capitol Rundown returns. Welcome back. It was a busy week for the Michigan legislature, where Democrats who control both chambers for the first time in some 40 years continued to pass items on their agenda. Among them, the Michigan House passed bills that would ban what's called conversion therapy on children. It's a phrase that's commonly used to describe therapy that some people use to try and make children who are gay or lesbian straight again. The measure has yet to pass the state Senate. Some 20 states have similar laws already. But the Senate passed a bill that would allow public universities to sell alcohol at some sporting events. If signed into law, it could go into effect as soon as this fall. The bill specifies that alcohol can be sold an hour before, during, and a half hour after a game if universities get liquor licenses. Of the 14 schools in the Big Ten Conference, only Nebraska, the University of Michigan, and Michigan State do not sell alcohol. The House also passed a bunch of election-related bills, many of which bring the state in line with Proposition 2, which voters passed last November. They set up rules for early voting and drop boxes for absentee ballots, as well as IDs and signatures. They passed along party lines, with Republicans saying they'll damage Michiganders' trust in elections. The bills now go to the Senate. And then there was a group of people at the Capitol trying to convince lawmakers to pass some bills. On Wednesday, car accident victims and their advocates urged lawmakers to guarantee that crash survivors get the medical care that they need. Michigan's no-fault auto insurance law was revised in 2019 and changes went into effect in 2021. The law saved drivers a bunch of money, but protesters say it cut medical care benefits for crash victims by 45%, and healthcare workers say they're affected as well.
We've seen some of the agencies that have gone out of business. Others just simply have suffered.
Right now, there is a case headed for the Michigan Supreme Court that could restore health care benefits to victims who were injured before 2019. Coming up, we'll tell you about some other bills working their way through the legislature and one that got signed by the governor. That and much more is coming up next. Earlier, we told you about some bills that have cleared either the Michigan House or Senate, but we're also tracking bills that are making their way through the process. A couple of them were inspired by the Larry Nassar scandal. Nassar was a doctor and athletic trainer who sexually abused hundreds of women and girls for decades under the guise of treatment. The bills considered by a House committee would educate students and staff about sexual assault and harassment and would outlaw medical professionals from misrepresenting to them that some form of sexual contact or penetration is necessary for their treatment. The committee also approved bills that would update the state's hate crime laws to include people who target others because of their gender identity or expression. They would also tackle people who vandalize or desecrate a place based on hate and let victims sue perpetrators in civil court for the damage they cause. And speaking of discrimination, the governor also signed a bill into law this week. The Crown Act prohibits people from discriminating against someone based on their natural hairstyle. Many people, particularly in the African American community, told the bill's sponsor that they've been sent home from school or work or passed up for a promotion because of the way they styled their hair. Michigan becomes the 23rd state with such a law. Also at the Capitol, Michigan Republicans gave their take on budget negotiations. Right now, the budget recommendation totals $79 billion. GOP leaders say they want to make sure their priorities are included in the final draft.
We're continuing to work and provide these suggestions. And I know our subcommittee vice chairs have continued to reach out, and we continue to hear crickets from the administration and from the other side and any negotiations on that.
The legislature must pass and present general appropriations bills for the upcoming fiscal year to the governor on or before July 1st. Well, because it was such a busy week in Lansing, that means there's plenty to talk about with our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic. So stay tuned. We'll get Tim's take right after the break. Welcome back. How is the race for Michigan's open Senate seat shaping up? And could Michigan give its electoral votes to a presidential candidate that loses the state? The Rundown's Jorma Duran had a couple of interesting questions this week for our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic, and here's Tim's take.
Tim, there's a new poll out that shows a close race for Michigan's open Senate seat between Democrat Elissa Slotkin and Republican James Craig. What did that tell you, and is the former Detroit police chief even really considering a bid?
Basically, Elissa Slotkin looks like the front runner right now for the Democrats on the Democratic side to replace Debbie Stabenow, and she's likely to get the U.S. Senate nomination, although that's not a foregone conclusion anyway. She's got a boatload of money, and she's run from mid-Michigan. She's not known elsewhere statewide, but it's juxtaposed to the numbers that James Craig got, and we should point out that Mr. Craig hasn't even decided if he's going to run for the U.S. Senate. It's all about raising the money. But here he is in a statistical dead heat with Elissa Slotkin. What I'm about to say should be tempered by the fact that most of the voters out there don't know who either of these people are. So factor this into the following. In a head-to-head contest, it's 40% for her, 39% for the former Detroit police chief and former unsuccessful candidate for the Republican nomination for governor. So it's a statistical dead heat. She does very well in Mr. Craig's backyard in the Detroit area, which is really kind of astounding because he basically owned that market when he was the Detroit police chief. But by the same token, he was doing very, very well with white voters, and she not so much. So it's an interesting head-to-head.
Michigan, as you know, is a battleground state in the presidential election, but there's talk about giving our electoral votes not to whoever wins the state, but whoever wins the country. What could the national popular vote mean for Michigan?
Let's say, for example, that Michigan votes for candidate Y. But under this proposal, all of the states would combine their electoral votes, and based on what happens in other states, theoretically, Michigan's vote for candidate Y could be basically eliminated by candidate X that everybody else picks. Mark Brewer, who is behind this effort, former Democratic Party chair, says this is all about one person, one vote. What the Republicans are saying, however, some of them, is this dilutes Michigan's impact in the presidential race. Right now, Michigan is up for grabs, and it's a competitive state. Going into this program could change all that.
Tim, Jorma, thank you. Well, it can be easy for the police to take your stuff if they think it was related to a crime, but getting your stuff back, that's another story. Coming up, we'll tell you about a Michigan congressman's fight to change that. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The police can seize your property if they think it's part of some illegal activity. Sounds logical, right? But in some places, they can keep or even sell that property even if the owner has not been convicted or even charged with a crime. And then it's up to the owner to prove that they should get their stuff back. It's called civil forfeiture. And it really bugs Michigan Congressman Tim Walberg, who has worked for years to reform those rules. His bill unanimously made it through the House Judiciary Committee this week, and we talked to him about his efforts.
We believe that law enforcement ought to have all of the ability that they need to go after bad actors. But there still should be due process. And when we see private citizens who have come under the gun, wrongly so, of having their assets forfeited or seized with no due process, at great negative impact to their businesses, to their livelihood, to their lives themselves, that has to change. Well, all this does is say that while you can still use civil asset forfeiture, police departments, we want you to have that opportunity. And if you seize properties that can be used for good purposes, that's all well and good, but let's follow due process. The government ought to be forced to show guilt and not force the private individual to prove his innocence before proven guilty. And that's all we're asking. And so I'm very hopeful that it'll go through. I believe it'll go through the House strongly because of the bipartisan vote in committee. And I think we have a good chance finally to get it through the Senate as well and to the president for signing. When you have a conservative Tim Walberg and a liberal Jamie Raskin, who led the impeachment trials, that makes a point when you have both the chairman, Jim Jordan, and the ranking member standing in favor of it as well, and it passing in a bipartisan fashion, 26-0. That starts it off well. I think as we now have an opportunity to talk to our colleagues on the floor and explain that we're not going against law enforcement, and while there be some law enforcement agencies speaking against it because they will say it's a tool that will be taken away from them. Once we describe that it's not taken away from them, just simply have to follow due process. You can still have those assets if it's proven to be that they were used illegally. I think that we have a strong chance of getting it through. And the attorney generals that were there before that gave us some problems aren't there anymore. And I think President Biden can be given the information that will show him that it's a valid point to sign.
Well, if you're interested in getting more political news from Michigan and Washington, we've got Just the Thing. You can sign up for our Capitol Rundown newsletter. It's just one email each week, and you can get it by pointing your cell phone camera at the screen right now. This will take you to the sign-up page, or you can head to WLNS.com/newsletter. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching the Capitol Rundown.